Okay, hi again. This is lecture 2, and we're going to talk about, excuse me, some of the concepts. I already talked about them in some of them in lecture 1. So the first one I did talk about was the ideal versus the real. But we're going to go ahead and do an assignment based on the ideal versus the real, which is to watch a documentary called The Plea, which I didn't put a link to. So The Plea is a frontline documentary done by PBS that looks at the plea bargaining system, which we talked about. The documentary is a number of years old. When it was made, 95% of plea bargaining, 90% of felony convictions were the result of a plea bargain. Now it's 97%. So it's going to give you a look at plea bargaining and how it works. So what you want to do is watch the film, and then you're going to do two things. One is to write a summary of it so I know that you've seen it. And you do the summary here where it says summary. And this is a form. And you fill out the form, you put your name, and then you just write a paragraph for each case, and press submit down at the bottom so I know that you've watched it. And the other part of this assignment is then to go to this link where it says ideal real and tell us 3 things that you see in the film that are contradictions for the ideal criminal justice system. So 3 things that you saw in the film that go against our ideal version. So what's the ideal and what do we see in the film that goes against the ideal? And that will go here under ideal real discussions, which I can see is where I actually linked to excuse me, the film, so I'll fix that. And then if you're interested, some people get invested and engaged with the people in the film, and there are follow-ups for each of them. If you go to this link and then click on their pictures, you can read more about the cases if you're interested. So we talked about the family as a safe place. So a few more things about sociology. So we talked before about paradigms and about how sociology is not, can go against what we tend to believe sometimes. And so we're going to make a distinction between kind of what everybody knows versus scientific knowledge. So kind of, we're not, sociology is not like common sense. It's not what everybody knows to be true, because some things that we all know to be true are not true. And we also need to remember that our experience is not everyone's experience. And that if we talk about something being true in general, it doesn't mean that it'll be true for us. So, you know, if we hear, like I had a student who was an African-American male, and I was talking about how African-American women tend to marry men who are less educated than they are. And he was like, oh yeah, that's true. My wife has a master's degree. And I was like, no, the fact that your wife has a master's degree doesn't make that statement true. That statement is true regardless of the state of your marriage. So you need to remember that what you experience doesn't necessarily mean the truth in the sense of the generalized truth. So we have to be careful of anecdotes, right? What we call anecdotal evidence, or what some people call anecdata. So anecdotes are your experience, and your experience, again, is not science. So if you found that you know, this group of people tends to be like this, or that group of people tends to be like that, or, you know, part of that can be the confirmation bias, and, you know, part of it can be our own prejudices, and part of it is, you know, we find what we're looking for in the world, and we just have to be careful about not thinking that our experience is everyone's experience. So I was talking once about, in a class, about how becoming a professional football player is not a good career plan. That people, the chances of a high school football player making it to the NFL are extremely small. And a student said, well, my brother-in-law is in the NFL. Excuse me. And I said, well, that's awesome, but that doesn't mean that it's the norm, right? It doesn't mean that that's what normally happens. So I had a student one time who was telling me about her sister. Her sister had a toddler who was 2, and everybody in the family was very concerned because the toddler was, you know, really attached to the mom, and the mom didn't leave the toddler with a babysitter, and, you know, kind of wherever the mom went, there was the toddler. And everybody was saying they needed to teach the child to, you know, be away from mom, and that it was going to make him grow up to be fearful and anxious. And the research is actually the other way. So children who have a safe, secure bond to a primary caregiver tend to be more courageous when they get older. So when we have a baby and a toddler and they have that strong attachment, it doesn't mean that they're going to be anxious. It generally means that they're going to be braver and more willing to step outside their comfort zone when they get older. Pushing kids to do things that they're not ready to do, that makes them anxious. So it was kind of counter to what she believed, based on, you know, her family's kind of ideas of how children attach and what you need to do in terms of teaching independence. And then another, you know, kind of common sense idea we have is that women talk more than men. And this is not true. Men actually tend to use more words in the day than women do, but women and men talk more or less in different circumstances. So you'll, you know, in like social, in this kind of environment, women will talk more. In this kind of environment, men will talk more. So the idea that, you know, women are always running their mouths and men sit quietly is not shown to be scientifically valid. So sociology comes in as one of the social sciences, and as I talked about before, sociology is interested in studying human behavior, and human behavior as it relates to society, and society is the kind of entity that develops when you get a group of people together. So when there's a group of people together, things change, right? It's different. And there's different levels, there's different ways of looking at the world, and sociology kind of can be involved in more than one way. So if we look at psychology, so we're talking about, like, looking at, my example here is high school. If we're looking at a high school and trying to understand behavior, or, you know, kind of what goes on in a high school. A psychologist is, I said before, going to be looking inside the individual children to explain behavior. So it can be looking at things like their personality, and personality, mental illness, ADHD, like a trait like IQ, mental disorders like narcissism or depression, and so it's again, inside the person. If a sociologist were to come in and study a high school, they would not be looking at what's inside individuals. They would be looking at how do the students organize themselves and what are the norms in the different groups. So what are the rules, right? We talked about values and norms. So what are the norms in your particular group? Social class. So how does social class come into play in the school? Is the school, is it a wealthy school? Is it not a wealthy school? What are the rules in terms of class and, how people act? And so sociology is going to be looking at the kind of interplay of people. Now, social psychology is a field that looks at the impact of society on the individual. Social psychology, to me, kind of combines the best of both worlds. It looks at sociology and psychology. So social psychology looks at things like if you take a group of students and at the beginning of the term you tell the teacher, these few students are doing really well, you're not going to have any trouble with them, and they're going to be your best students, but these guys over here are going to be a problem, and you're going to need to keep an eye out for them. At the end of the term, the end of the semester, the better students will be doing better, and the not better students will not, even if what was said to the teachers was based was random. It was just, we just picked kids to say that about. It wasn't said about any particular behavior. So the social expectations that people have actually change people's behavior. And so this is the impact of society on your internal state. And so we also might look as, if you move from group to group in high school, how does your personality change? So what's the impact of the social groups that you belong to? How does that affect your personality? Or if you join kind of the wrong group, do you start doing more deviant acts? And so how does that affect you? And then sociobiology looks at the impact of society on the body, usually the brain. So we know that, for example, that parents having high expectations of performance, like in either for grades or in other areas, like in a concert, increases levels of cortisol. Cortisol can be measured easily in the saliva, and so the higher your parents' expectations, the more cortisol you have. And cortisol is that not good feeling it's a stress hormone. So if you feel pressure, you're going to have cortisol. And then IQ. So growing up in extreme poverty, I don't mean being poor. I mean being part of the underclass. Like I was talking about my daughter's family, but there's literally not enough to eat, or maybe there's periods of homelessness, or actually affects the brain. It affects the structure of the brain, as does abuse. And one of the effects of both abuse and poverty is on the amygdala. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that signals danger. And so what happens when children are abused is that they are more easily threatened as they grow up, which can lead to difficulty, right? If the world feels threatening, it can create a lot of difficulty as you grow up, or they're also less able to regulate their emotions. And a big part of being in society is learning how to regulate your emotions, and how to deal with people and not get overwhelmed. So when your boss yells at you, you don't punch him, or you don't get depressed and stop going to work. So learning how to manage emotions is a big job. And if there's the stress of poverty, or if things are going on so that you're not able to developmentally do what you need to do, then you can end up with literal changes in the brain that then affect behavior. So so psychology, all inside; sociology, all outside; social psychology, the effect of the outside on the psyche; sociology, sociobiology, the effect of the outside on the brain and the body. So I talked before about the sociological perspective, and particularly the sociological imagination, and the Harvard thing. So here's the links about the tuition if you're interested. But two more terms here. One is beginner's mind, that we try to cultivate in sociology. And beginner's mind is a concept from Buddhism, which is that we try to kind of empty out our preconceived notions and kind of come to the table with our minds open, being willing to consider things that maybe go against what we're used to thinking or how we're used to seeing the world. So if we're used to, for example, thinking about the world in terms of people who are poor are not working hard enough, to think about like systems and cultural reasons why people remain in poverty can be difficult. So the more we can kind of open up and try to put our preconceived notions down, the more it helps take some of the new ideas in. And for some people, like trying to see your own culture is like fish trying to see water. It's like when you think about why you didn't go to Harvard, like a lot of people talked about just kind of the basic, like, well, I didn't have the GPA, or I didn't, but if we, there are also like deeper running reasons in culture about why, excuse me, why the Ivy League colleges remain like bastions of wealth and whiteness. Well, now with a lot more Asian people coming in, so it's hard to see it, and so we try to do beginner's mind. And again, this isn't a cult. You don't have to believe in the validity of the perspectives, but you need to be able to learn them. And the other thing we try to develop is something we call culture shock. And culture shock is if you go to a new culture and all the stuff you take for granted is different, and it can lead to that kind of state of stress. One of the reasons it's stressful to travel to new places is that at home, you don't have to think about how far you stand from a stranger when you talk to them. But when you go to another country, you have to think about it, because the distance that two strangers stand from each other when they're speaking, that distance is set by the culture. And if you're talking to a stranger and they've shortened that distance or they've made it too wide, you're going to be uncomfortable. So if you go to another culture and their distance is, say, half of what ours is, then it's going to be stressful to try and talk to someone who you don't know. So we try to develop that kind of awareness, again, about our own culture and trying to see things and just kind of how weird life is. If you think about, for example, riding an elevator, there are so many rules in our culture for riding an elevator. And no one taught us these rules, but we've learned them, and violating them is not a good thing and can result in sanctions, like, people finding you weird and not wanting to be, have a friendship with you, or at work, they can get you isolated. And like some of the rules in the elevator are, well, we know the obvious, like you wait for people to get off before you get on, and that for me is like the only one I've specifically taught my daughter. But if you think about when you get on an elevator, like the person standing by the buttons becomes, for the ride of the elevator, kind of the button pusher, right? And they either are asking people what floor, or people are telling them or asking them, please, what floor. And so they kind of take on that job. And then when you're standing in an elevator, there are certain ways that you can stand, certain places that you can face, right? You can face towards the doors, and then you can look up, right? You can look at the numbers across the top, or you can look at the buttons, and that's pretty much it. If you're facing sideways, right, you can kind of look across from you and maybe at the numbers at the top. Right? You cannot face backwards on an elevator, and in general, you don't want to strike up a lot of conversations with people, right? Talking to people that you don't know on the elevator is kind of iffy. And there's also this distancing thing that we do. So when you get on an elevator, you need to make sure there's a distance between you and the other person on the elevator. So if there's only one other person on the elevator, you don't go stand next to that person. But if there's a lot of people on the elevator, people are in really close contact with each other. But if you stood like that without a lot of people on the elevator, it would not be good. So these are the kinds of things that we try to see, and just how weird it is that we just have all these rules. And if you think about, for example, like a public restroom and all the rules about a public restroom, and we have this for everything, driving onto a parking lot, and all the other areas, like checking out at a grocery store, where there are rules. And society gives us these rules so we can function, but we're so used to them, they just are like water and we're the fish. So the other thing is the sociological imagination, which we talked about, which is being aware of that connection between your experience and the society that you live in, right? That your experience is not happening in a vacuum. And that while we tend to look at our own experiences and look to psychology or circumstance, like I said before, that we really need to look at our own story and look at the point in history where we are. And we need to understand the connection between personal troubles and social issues, meaning that if you're having trouble finding a job, that's a personal problem, but it also can be a social issue, right? If the economy's bad, or there are no jobs, in your state, because the main economy was coal, and the coal factory, the coal mining has been shut down. When I first moved to Oregon, Oregon was in the throes of the timber industry, just collapsing. And there were all these people losing their jobs. And they lived in these towns in the middle of nowhere in the woods, and there were no other jobs. And so, you know, the fact that people didn't have work was not just about them. And then the other issue with this personal experience and wider society, the personal experience is the micro level, and the wider society is, we call the macro level. And I talked about the lens zooming in and out. So you are, in the next section, we're going to be talking about levels of analysis. We're going to talk about the micro and macro. But we need to understand for ourselves that, you know, our day-to-day experience is the micro level, and then the macro level is when we zoom back and look at our neighborhood, our city, our country, and the world. Okay, and that's it for this section, and I will see you in the next one.